enthusiasts in the room. I think it's a growing field and it's also quite a young field. But there's been a lot of new developments over the past 4 years, and I want to share a couple of thoughts with this cryptic title Diving DEEPGRAFT. And we'll get back to that later. If you want to get in contact with me, you can scan the QR code and get more information. So I have some conflicts of interest related to this topic. So a bit of outline of what I'm going to talk about is why do we need AI in physics. So if everything works already perfectly well, let's say the pathologist can do a very good job, there's no room for improvement. But actually there is, and I'll talk a little bit about that and what type of algorithms are actually interesting to incorporate. In this talk I will mostly cover deep learning on histological tissues, digitized histological tissues, but many concepts actually apply also to all the things that Alex has talked about. It's general, I would say, for AI algorithms and algorithms in general. I will try to introduce some new applications that are under development by certain groups. And I was mostly asked to also talk about the road towards clinical implementation. It's actually quite early to talk about that, but the field is progressing so fast that it's actually, it's good to start thinking about that on an early stage as well. So I'll talk about the dangers of implementing AI in practice. So I want to start off with this new report that we've been working on and it's been published recently. This is an overview of the reporting guidelines in clinical AI. So I think a lot of people, they are familiar with Tripod and with START, Spirit, maybe Consort. Now for all these guidelines there's also an AI component because there are some things that are AI specific that you have to keep in mind when you evaluate AI algorithms in healthcare. And in this talk I will mostly talk about this early part of implementation, development implementation. And I think yesterday we heard a very good example of how long it will take before you actually hear. It's a very long road, but it's nice to have this overview. So if you want to have this overview, you can go to these two references. This is also what we heard this morning, so I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with artificial intelligence or AI. There's a lot of hype. I think AI, it's a very broad definition, and you can basically say, well, it's not real intelligence in the sense it's not human intelligence. So everything else you can consider as artificial intelligence. And actually it's every algorithm where a computer makes a decision, you can consider AI. Machine learning is a subgroup of AI, or a subset of AI algorithms that have some sort of potential to iteratively learn some optimization process. And deep learning is like a subgroup of that uses these neural networks that are deep to get really flexible flexible algorithms that can mimic basically any equation. So it's very, very prone to overfitting, as we've heard already before. So this is a question I get quite a lot actually. So when are we going to be replaced by robots? There should be a microscope here because I'm a pathologist. I'm not sure if this is actually going to happen. Maybe one day, we'll see. But we're talking about decision support systems. So they have to support us in our daily life and make it easier. They might do things that we cannot do. But I'm not sure they will ever replace us if it was only not from legal, decision making. Somebody has to be responsible at the end. And I'm not sure if the AI companies really want to take that responsibility. So it might actually look a little bit like this. This is an overview from the KPMP consortium. We have these kidney biopsies, we digitize them in whole slide images. So these actually mimic the microscope that we use, only in digital format, so we can actually go through it. And we have some neural networks that do image processing, maybe some pre-designed networks, pre-designed handcrafted features that we can extract. And we have the visual assessment by the pathologist, all working together, integrating in this clinical pipeline. So it probably will look something like this. So I can bash a little bit my own field. So what are things that pathologists or humans in general, I would say, are not so good at? Because that's where the room for improvement is, I think. we tend not to agree on quantifications. In fact, we are actually semi-quantitative, and you can see that this is the fibrosis score, the IFTA score. It's quite a wide category. 26% means something else than 49%, but they're all grouped in the same category, and I think we can do better. But especially also the agreement on these categories. Yeah, there's definitely room for improvement. That also holds true for the diagnosis, the final diagnosis. In general, we tend to agree a little bit more on the final diagnosis than on the individual lesions. I think the group from Marseille has shown that nicely in Transplant International. Some things that we actually cannot do. So, for instance, measuring the diameter of a tubule. We can do one, but we cannot do 2,000 at the same time. So these morphometrics, they give new quantitative measures that we as pathologists don't have the time, or we don't have the time to do that. Predicting future events. I think in general humans are not very good at predicting the future. Integrating data from multiple sources, we are also not very good at in general. And communicating findings, we are also not so good at, because we know that most of the, let's say, the flaws in healthcare, they appear when communication fails. And AI can actually help with communication as well. Okay, so this is a very well-known study from 2004 already, showing the kappa values for these older definitions of the Banff categories before and after visual reassessment, so visual feedback from the authors, and actually you see that it does not improve if you say, well, this is how glomerulitis looks like, score again. It actually does not improve, and sometimes people get more confused. So there's a limitation as a group what we can actually achieve, and it's important to know that limitation. We did a recent study, so this is about this DEEPGRAFT study, which is a study on 1,055 biopsies, and we asked 3 pathologists to score all these biopsies for 20 categories, the whole Banff classification. So it's a lot of work, but you can actually calculate all these statistics over all these cases and really get a good grip of how what the inter-observer variability is for let's say the whole spectrum of kidney pathology. We use here the wet AC2, which is similar to the kappa value, but has some, let's say, good properties that make it more reproducible. And you can see that we are not doing so bad for some lesions. When you ask 3 pathologists to score, for some lesions like IFTA, the pathologists were not that good. But overall, you can see that there's some spread of reproducibility over all these cases. We did also a subset. We asked 4 pathologists and 5 pathologists, and you can compare them here. And you can see that it doesn't matter if you ask 4 pathologists or 5 pathologists, let's say the kappa values, in this case is wet values, they remain relatively stable. So there's also here not that much room for improvement, I would say. But there's only one thing the thing that let's say that these measures that you get is over all these cases, you get one number, and that one number should represent the variability over all these cases. And actually, it's far more interesting to look at the variability per case, because one case can be more difficult than another case. And actually, you want to maybe have a look at multiple of these Banff parameters for one case and say something about the difficulty of a slide. So that's actually what we did. So all these 1,055 biopsies, we had all these Banff scores for 3 pathologists, and we borrowed a measure from the field of information theory that uses entropy. I will not go into much detail here, but what you can actually do is for each of the Banff scores, for each of the slides, you can get a consensus score from 0 to 1. And you can then look, okay, well, if we have all these, for all these 20 parameters for the Banff scores, we can calculate actually this consensus score, and then average the consensus score says something about the biopsy. And that might be actually interesting, because you can relate that to individual parameters of that patient or that biopsy. And you can see that there's, so this is the frequency of the consensus score. This is the normalized consensus score that goes from 0 to 1. You can see that there's actually some sort of distribution of how much consensus we have per case. So this is the frequency of each of the cases. And here you can see this split up for active lesions and for chronic lesions, and you can see that we tend to agree more for chronic lesions than on active lesions. Well, that's all nice, but does it actually matter? Well, that's an interesting question to answer. We'll come back to that later. There's not that much difference over the years, so if you take all the biopsies, the consensus remains relatively stable. Not without surprise, if you have more glomeruli, the consensus goes up a little bit on average. And if you have more high percentage of globally sclerosed glomeruli, the consensus goes down. So it becomes more difficult to score these cases. Well, does that matter? Yeah, so we can, because we calculated it on the individual case, you can actually relate it in a survival model to outcomes. So that's what we actually did. Here I split it up in 4 quartiles for visualization purposes. And you can really see that if you're in the higher quartile of consensus, that these patients tend to, at least there's a correlation with outcome. Whereas you have, on average, a low, so if you're in the lower quartile of consensus, these patients, they are associated with a worse outcome. You can see that here also in the Cox model, and here actually corrected for the average of all the Banff scores. So this appears to be quite an interesting parameter that maybe has some prognostic value even. Why that is, I don't know, but at least it's an interesting observation, I think. So now let's jump into the digital pathology, because I think digital pathology can actually help reduce this inter-observer variability as one of the main, let's say, goals that we have for creating these algorithms. So this is normally how we assess the biopsy. We have a microscope and we have this glass slide, and now it looks very small, but it has a lot of detail. We heard it this morning as well. Many pixels. You can actually not see the individual pixels here, so you have to go even deeper, and now you see that it becomes a little bit pixelated. So actually these whole slide images, they are very high dimensional. You can actually compare it to the DNA in terms of data points that you have in one single whole slide image. So in comparison, the whole CT scan, so this is not one slide, but the whole CT scan is around 200 times smaller in size than one whole slide image. So very high dimensional. That means that if you want to create AI algorithms, you really have to do a lot of image compression in a smart way to really have an, have an effective algorithm at the end. So one of the things that we can do, we saw a little bit about it in the talk from Jeroen this morning, is semantic segmentation. So this is a self-driving car, and of course it should not hit any people. So the people here are actually the pixels for people are segmented in red. So all these, let's say these pixels are then grouped into classes that have some sort of semantic meaning. You don't want to bump into the cars, they are blue. So actually this car can read the environment and take that into account when driving around. And this is actually very useful. Well, we can do a similar thing for pathology. And so we can ask we can create an algorithm that can actually delineate all these objects. It's also called semantic segmentation. You see my postdoc student Ling. She is actually annotating all these structures because it's a lot of work. Because you have to supervise which pixels belong to which class. So at the end, you really want to have all these, let's say, structures that you find in the biopsy. You have to annotate, and then you can train the algorithm supervised to recognize these structures. We do that with UNets. I will not go into detail, but you will get something like this. We saw that this morning as well. It's a study from Radboud together with Mayo that we collaborated as well. And you can see here that similar to the self-driving cars, every structure gets a color. So you actually reduce your dimensions a lot. So you go from 50,000 to 50,000 pixels to a couple of classes. So this is really a lot of compression. This is work from the KPMP consortium. This is one of the algorithms that can recognize tubuli, also works very well. So there are actually now a couple of these semantic segmentation algorithms that can really delineate the structures in whole slide images, and it's very exciting work, I think. You can actually calculate also metrics of it. So this is what we typically do. We give it a score, a CI or CT score of 3. But you can actually ask the algorithm how many of these objects were atrophied of all the tubules that I can quantify. And then you can just get a really quantitative measure of tubular atrophy, and the same you can do for interstitial fibrosis. So we can do quantifications based on these genetic segmentations. They actually correlate very nicely with also the increase in score by the pathologist. So you can see 3 pathologists, and you can also nicely appreciate the inter-observer variability. But in general, if the score of the pathologist goes up, also the score of the network goes up. So this is a way how you can validate these networks as well. You can also do other types of quantification. This is a study from Aachen in Germany, the group of Peter Bohr. And they just ask, okay, well, quantify for me all the surface that is related to tubuli, to glomeruli, artery, and then you can get, let's say for a healthy, I think this was mouse kidney, you can actually get like a pie chart representing the surface quantified by AI. And you can see that if you have these animal models, that the composition of your quantifications differs. So this is a different way of looking at the bites. This is really something we as pathologists cannot do. You can also ask different things, for instance, what is the diameter of all these tubules, and you can make these same quantitative maps, and you can see differences in different preclinical models. We heard a little bit about the DEEPGRAFT study this morning, and basically this is from a recently published study that we also collaborated on. This is a model where we have these pastains slides. You have one algorithm that can detect lymphocytes, one algorithm that can detect the structures. So if you combine these, you can actually detect the lymphocytes inside, outside structures, and you can do quantitative Banff scores basically. That need to be validated, of course, but it's far more quantitative than we can do now with these categories of 25 to 50%. And actually, they correlate very well with the scores that we do. So this is, let's say, the AI definition of how you would calculate based on all these maps, and they correlate very nicely with the actual scores of the Banff classification. Another thing that you can do is classification. This is a little bit more difficult because you actually have to compress your images even more, because here the only label that you will give is TMA. And so all these 50,000 by 50,000 pixels, if you compress to one single diagnosis, which is a far more complicated task. So you need actually quite a lot of images to do that. We did that also in DEEPGRAFT, and we'll get back to that, but I will introduce you a little bit on how you could do that. Here you have this whole-slide image. This is a pastain. You cut it in smaller pieces because this whole image does not fit in the GPU. You cut it in different images. All these images get the same label, mainly the slide label, so for instance TMA. You can imagine that only maybe a small region of that slide actually has the positive signal, so many of these slides will be not informative, or at least will be negative for the case. You can extract features from that and process those features. In this case, it's depicted from the CLAM algorithm from Boston, and you can do some classification on the whole slide image. So this is a process that, you compress first pixels to features, and these features you can actually classify, and it works quite well. But it's a difficult task. We did that in this DEEPGRAFT study that we recently published on 5,500 whole slide images. So this is really a large set of images. We had made a training cohort from Amsterdam and Utrecht and validated or externally applied it on cases from Aachen. And then you can calculate the metrics on the slides from Aachen. We had 3 categories, namely just as a proof of concept: normal slides, these were the pathologist's diagnosis; rejection, or this, let's say, big group of other pathologies. So this includes TMA, it includes ATN, recurrent disease, and actually we cannot differentiate that because they would be so heterogeneous. But we were interested in, can it actually detect rejection amongst all these biopsies? You can then make heat maps. That, if you remember these different patches, that's where the signal is, that we get the signal from. So from each of these patches you can get a probability score, and the higher probability for rejection, the more yellow the patch will be visualized. And actually in those patches you can say, okay, which pixels were actually important for this classification, and then you can get some region. This is a little bit difficult to understand because you will start interpreting it yourself and say, okay, I see some inflammatory cells, well this fits with rejection. but it's not a proof that there's some room for interpretation. Let's put it like that. But it can give you some visual feedback, at least what the model is trying to, what the model is using for this classification. Here you see some more examples from rejection biopsies. Here's this heat map that we sampled here, the top, a couple of top predictive patches, and you can see some features that we know, like capillaritis, some tubulitis, some interstitial inflammation. Actually, the interesting thing is there were not that many glomeruli that popped up, and there was definitely a lot of antibody-mediated rejection there as well. But you can imagine that most of the tissue is tubulo-interstitium, and apparently it really optimizes for it. It is enough to optimize the algorithm for tubulo-interstitium to make a diagnosis of rejection. And so this is the whole group of rejection. But there's definitely room for improvement there as well. So now let's go to the implementation. So what do you actually need? You really need to adequately validate the tools that you're creating. Very importantly also, you need a digital infrastructure. And this does not mean just a slide scanner. You actually need the whole infrastructure, and I will get back to that a little bit later. I showed you these early adoption guidelines. Follow them because they can give you tips also on what is important. We need randomized trials to see if we can actually, the AI algorithms can support the clinical pathologist in improving the diagnosis, and I think you had some nice examples about that. And also this part of hosting and distributing your software. If you want to implement it in different centers, well, there's this painstaking work that you have to go through. I won't go into detail because I think it's not, we're not there yet. So what do I mean with adequately validating tools? We're talking about pixel data. This is a nice, actually very nice paper for everybody who is involved in image processing. They define in that paper multiple scenarios where you should choose a certain metric for your validation. Something that we use quite often is the dice coefficient, and the dice coefficient says something about the overlap of your prediction and your annotation. And if they completely overlap, your dice coefficient is 1. Well, let's go to this example. For instance, here you have 3 objects, one big one and 2 small ones. You can see that this algorithm actually predicts here that this big object is there, and it also predicts these objects that it doesn't recognize. You have a very high dice score, but it detects 2 objects that are actually not there. In another scenario, you can see that your dice score is actually lower, but you actually detect these 3 objects. So important, the dice score says something about pixel overlap, but we're talking here about objects. So you really need a metric that looks at objects and not at pixels. And so there's all these scenarios are discussed in this paper. It's very nice. Another scenario, something that happens quite often is we design algorithms and actually they work better for female than for male, or male and female in this case. And so you really need to do sensitivity analysis and try to stress test your algorithms to see if they perform well in at least populations that you know. Something else here, for instance, this is what you see a lot. People design a case control study. Of course, looking for cases. Sometimes the cases are very rare, but you can artificially, let's say, balance that out. But in general, in real practice, you maybe have only one case, and that actually makes a great deal for your accuracy. So you really need to take into account the prevalence of the disease, or the prevalence of your object. Objects can also be rare, like a vessel. So these are some examples. Other examples. This is something that's called domain shift. We talked about it also a little bit in the talk from Jeroen. Humans are very good at, let's say, classifying images independent of how it looks. And so we understand that this is an airplane, we understand that this is an airplane, we understand that this is a basketball, here's a basketball. So we as humans are very good at interpreting an image, and we are very, let's say, our domain is very, very wide. For AI, often that's not the case. We have a very specific question, and when you then stress test, for instance, by having a slide from a different scanner, all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. So you really have to validate it also in clinical practice. I don't know if you're familiar with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but we really need to understand what we are looking at. So this is deep thought. So the aliens, they They created an AI algorithm that had to answer questions about life and the universe and everything, and after a lot of thinking, it came up with 42. Maybe it's the correct answer, but nobody knows what it means, so it's a useless algorithm because we don't know what it does. So you really need to understand what's going on here, and I think this is a very interesting example of that. So, going back to that digital infrastructure, so it's not only the scanner, you need the pathology software, you need the PACS, so where you can actually view the images. The PACS has to communicate with the digital slides, they have to communicate with your algorithms, you have to create a report, and so that infrastructure is actually pretty extensive, quite expensive also. The business case is not that good, but yeah, okay, for radiology probably in the beginning was also not good. So we see in the Netherlands quite some academic centers and also some regional hospitals actually digitizing their complete practice. I'm not sure if people, maybe there are some people that already have also some digital infrastructure. Well, building in these AI algorithms is going to be quite a pain, but for instance, we use Sectra and they can actually do that as well. So going back to this Decide AI paper about this first, let's say the first implementation of these algorithms, some interesting things that you have to think about when you talk about AI algorithms in clinical practice. I highlighted these two. So there's you have to account for the changing nature of your intervention. In this case, it's that healthcare AI algorithm, because your population can change. Maybe your scanner has a software update, and all of a sudden your algorithm doesn't work anymore. So you really have to account for all these things that come with continuous learning. Your population might change if you add new cases, and they're also used to predict the next case. That's actually something you have to take into account. Also something that I already talked about, you have to check if there's if it doesn't predict any health inequalities. So there's this interesting paper, it's actually quite shocking. This is a study from, I think, from Stanford, where they created an algorithm based on X-ray images to predict race. That's how you can see this is the accuracy. This algorithm can predict race. We don't know why, but it can. So the signal is in these images, and you have to take that into account. And for pathology, we don't know, but this is, for instance, the skin. Yeah, we as pathologists, we can see there's some pigmentation, but the algorithm might actually come up with a different classification just because there's interference of the pigmentation of the skin. For the kidney, we have no idea if we can actually differentiate these things. So it is important to have this in mind. Maybe it's not something that we can fix from the beginning, but if you take that into account with your sensitivity analysis, at least you have an idea how the performance is. This is a recent study from Nancy Digital Health, where they actually propose that you have to stress test your algorithms. So I'm specifically going to talk about this adversarial testing. And so this is X-ray images. You can see that the goal of this algorithm was to detect fractures. There was one patient with Paget, and actually it completely failed to detect fractures in the patient with Paget. We saw this actually also in our own study that was recently published. We created an algorithm that can detect rejection. So this was the prediction that we can do. Rejection versus other diseases. But we know that there were also some viral infections, and they're notoriously difficult to distinguish from T-cell mediated rejection. And you can actually see that, let's say half of the cases were predicted as being other diseases, which you would expect for a viral infection, but actually the other half were classified as rejection, just because we did not include a different classification for PK nephropathy in this case. Adversarial testing, this is an interesting example. A classification algorithm that can classify animals. It's classified as a panda. There's some what they call adversarial attack. Some image that does not make sense. If you combine these images, the classification goes completely wrong. So these things actually, there's a lot of stress testing in the field of AI, and you may want to try to make your algorithms robust for these adversarial attacks. This is also an interesting example, we heard it also from Jeroen this morning, if you rotate your image a little bit, maybe the classification is completely different. So you have to do that during training as well. And actually, this concept, what they call concept drift, so this is what I was talking about, also that you might have updates from your scanner. This might actually mess up completely your classification. You have to actually be aware that when you incorporate all these things into clinical practice, that your practice actually might change over time. And your practice, it might be a technical thing, but also a biological thing. If we start treating patients with different medications, the pictures that we get might look different. So okay, so to wrap up, some take-home messages. I think deep learning is an interesting tool for potential making renal pathology potentially quantitative. It's also an algorithm. It's also a tool to help potentially to support medical decision making and also communications towards, for instance, patients. If you have a nice heat map. Deep learning can drastically reduce its observability, and I think that's actually one of the major advantages of doing deep learning. Because if you have a trained algorithm, you put in the same image, you get the same outcome. And that for pathology is not the case. If you ask a week later, it might change a little bit. It might be the wrong outcome, but at least it's consistent. So it's actually can reduce the observability quite a bit. And at the end, you have to really stress test your algorithms in clinical practice before you go live, and especially when you have this continuous data stream that will update your algorithm all the fly. And with that, I want to end this talk. If people are interested, the pathologists are interested to contribute to the reader study that I just showed, we are validating actually the algorithms. You can contact me through this QR code. You will get a form, a Google form, and you can register your interest as well. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you so much. I think in the interest of time and to give Dr. Sardar time to speak, we'll go ahead and get started, and then we'll turn to you for questions for both of you.